come back to order. So before we go to the next item on our agenda, we're going to reverse course and go back to item 15.03, which was originally on the consent agenda and was pulled. Board Member Rankin, would you be kind enough to read the
Madam
motion?
Chair,
Whoops.
before Board Member Rankin reads those motions, I believe Mr. Durham has, or I'm sorry, Board Member Durham has a couple of motions to make.
What? Go. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Having voted on the prevailing side, I move to reconsider the placing of item 15.06 on the consent agenda and return it to the regular agenda.
Oh, nope, 15.01 is what you would like to.
It says 15.06.
Well, that, so.
Oh, I see. Okay. All right, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Having voted on the prevailing side, I move to reconsider our action that placed item 15.01 on the consent agenda and return it to the regular order of business.
I think you mean to amend the consent agenda to, that you accidentally had pulled 15.06 and instead would like to pull 15.01 from the consent agenda. Does that sound about right?
Yes. What,
Well,
you're so bad.
excuse me, Madam Chair. I think 15.06 is not on the consent agenda at the present time.
That's the one you had pulled off.
And I
yes.
think we just vote on that in the ordinary course of business. We don't have to
Right.
return it to the consent agenda.
That's correct.
So the only thing I need to deal with is 15.01, which is actually been approved as
Right.
part of the consent agenda. So the motion to reconsider is only relative to 15.01, and then
Right.
I think we can deal with 15.06
Correct.
in the normal course of business.
Correct.
Right. So I'm only dealing with 15.01.
Correct.
Thank
Do I
you.
need a
second
second? Oh, good. We got a second. Yay.
I'm sorry, who had seconded?
Board Member Rankin seconded the date.
Thank you. Madam Chair?
Thank you.
So is this one we're going to lay over?
Yes. Yeah, if it gets back to the consent agenda, or off the consent agenda, then I'll move to lay it over to the next meeting.
All right. Is there any objection to Mr. Durham's motion? No. So it is passed.
Okay.
So it now,
So, Madam Chair, I move item 15.01 lay over until the February meeting,
14th.
retaining its place on the calendar.
Right. Thank you.
And then I believe you also wanted to lay over item 15.04.
Right, but we need to do it
Go
all at
for it.
once. Sure, we can do it. I move that no, I want to deal with what's been reconsidered first, separately.
Do we have to vote on this?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
Any objection? Does anybody understand what we're doing? Okay, good.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I will now move to lay item 15.04 over until the
February 14th.
February meeting, retaining its place on the calendar.
Thank you. Any objection? So we have taken an item off the consent agenda and laid it over to next month. We've taken an item that we were to vote on today and moved it to next month.
Correct.
Mr. Durham, do you want to make some more motions?
Nope.
No, I think Ms. Birdsall is absolutely correct. I do not wish to make any more motions.
She is fast.
Yes, thank you for saving me.
That is correct.
And 15.06.
Madam Chair, I would like to go with the original staff recommendation for 15.03 regarding disciplinary proceedings concerning a license, charge number 201, 6EC 854, signify acceptance and approval of the stipulation for the suspension of the credential holder's license and adopt the order by directing the chair of the state board to sign the final agency order.
Is it proper
Second.
motion? Thank you. I think you need to call the vote, please.
Board Member Durham.
Yes.
Board Member Flores.
Yes.
Board Member Goff.
Yes.
Board Member Masnick.
No.
Board Member McClellan.
Yes.
Board Member Rankin.
Yes.
Board Member Schroeder.
No.
No.
But that passes
That
5-2.
motion fact two.
Okay, Board Member Rankin, got another one?
Yes. 15.06 regarding, I make a motion that we go with the original staff recommendation regarding disciplinary proceedings concerning an authorization, charge number 2017, EC 1478. Signify acceptance and approval of the terms and conditions of the stipulation and final agency order by directing the chair of the State Board to sign the final agency order.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you. Want to call the vote, please?
Board Member Durham?
This is 15.6.
06.
The one that accidentally you had
This
pulled,
is-
yes.
You
Yes.
didn't mean to pull it on.
Okay.
Yes.
Board Member Flores?
Yes.
Board Member Goff?
Yes.
Board Member Masnick?
Yes.
Board Member McClellan?
Yes.
Board Member Rankin?
Yes.
Board Member Schroeder?
Yes.
Thank you. Passes 7-0.
Should we have erred again, please let us know. We really did our best to.
Absolutely.
I'm
Thank you.
wondering if, quite honestly, it wouldn't be helpful if we put the agenda number on this sheet, because I think that,
Be very
Yes.
helpful.
Yes.
That can be done, absolutely.
I would be grateful, we would be grateful.
I can do that.
That might help us. Because the
Coordinate.
name isn't here, the name is here.
Right.
Then there's that, it's that detail number that's the only thing that crosses over.
Can absolutely do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are we ready for 6.0? One? All right, part 3. Next item on our agenda is a continued conversation and update on the standards review and revision process focusing on the science standards. And thank you for your patience, folks. I really do appreciate it. Commissioner?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. This is our third part for this board meeting, so we're going to be reviewing the science standards as recommended from the committee. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Colsman and Dr. Cobb to lead us through the beginning.
Thank you, Commissioner Anthus. Madam Chair, members of the board, we're here for part 3 of the standards review and revision process update for January. This particular presentation will focus on the science standards. And with us today, our guest presenters, to my far right are John Elfson. He's an assistant to the principal in Cherry Creek Schools. To my far left is Dr. Charlie Warren from the University of Northern Colorado. He's a teacher education licensure officer. And to my immediate left is Dr. Joanna Bruno. She is our science content specialist. The format of this presentation will go in the same formats that you have previously been experiencing throughout this board meeting, and we'll talk to you a little bit about next steps. And so at this point, I will transition the presentation over to Dr. Bruno, who will talk to you about the standards process.
Thank you, Dr. Cohn. It is my pleasure today to help represent the recommendation of the Science Committee. First, we will just reacclimate you to the standards that we currently have, and the ones that were proposed are in the same strands. Standard 1 is physical science, Standard 2 is earth science, and Standard 3 is earth and space science. To start the process, much like all other content areas, science also had a benchmarking report that was commissioned by the department. In 2014, WestEd conducted a review of our standards in relation to other national and international standards for benchmark. The primary findings from that study were that our core academic standards for science have conceptual gaps within the elementary standards. They lack general coherence and depth and breadth when compared to the highest national standards. To align to the science standards more closely at the elementary grades to the highest national standard would require some significant retooling of the content areas covered. The third, having some alignment with national benchmarks at the middle and high school levels. However, there are differences within all depth and breadth at certain concepts and strands, and overall coherence for the middle school and high school. And then lastly, our core academic standards do not contain engineering practices. In addition to the benchmarking report, the committee's also considered data that was received from online feedback. And this online feedback, these trends came pre-committee work. So this is the feedback they received on the core academic standards as they currently are. So the general feedback was that they for the committee to address organizational issues so important concepts and skills are not lost in overgeneralized grade level expectations. Also, they are requesting the committee to increase coherence and learning progressions across grades. And then lastly, that they wanted nature, science, or inquiry should be embedded in all the standards. And then specific feedback was the 7th and 8th grade. They felt that there were too many grade level expectations in those grades. So I'll turn over the committee recommendations to our first co-chair, Mr. John Ailson.
Thank you, Joanna. One of the things that we considered was to incorporate some of the components of the next generation of science standards into the evidence outcomes, as well as the right side of the document. The committee chose to incorporate a large part of the next generation science standards into the proposed Colorado academic standards due to the alignment with the research-based K-12.
We're not hearing you very well.
I'm sorry.
I don't know.
I apologize.
Pull it closer.
There we go. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay.
Definitely, but would you also be kind enough to describe the next generation science standards?
Sure.
Please.
So the next generation science standards came from a document that was research-based from the
National? Yep.
yeah.
Here's the framework.
We actually will be getting to that in just a moment or two.
Okay,
So
sorry.
if you would like, we can.
I'm happy to wait. I
Okay.
just wanted to make
Thank
sure that we go into that so that we
Yep.
know.
So what the committee decided to do was, instead of a direct adoption of next generation science standards, but more of an adaptation of the next generation of science standards. So it goes to the next slide. So some of the factors that the committee considered. In 2017, the Public Standards Perception Survey went out, and specific science responses included. The respondents indicated that it is extremely very important to have consistent academic standards for students in Colorado, 75% felt that way, as well as across the states in the U.S., 60% felt that way. When asked what level of revision was needed for the science standards, 30% of the teachers indicated a moderate revision was needed, and 43% of the teachers indicated that a substantial and/or complete revision was necessary. Science teachers also responded that it is extremely or very important that the standards be based on research. In addition, rural superintendents, as well as the Office of Assessment at the Colorado Department of Education, requested a crosswalk document to go along with College Board non-AP standards. It was found that there was higher alignment between the next generation of science standards and the College Board compared to the 2009 Colorado academic standards. Other factors that the committee considered. The committee considered the research base for science education from the National Research Council. The number of Colorado districts that are already using the next generation science standards in their science programs. Universities, informal educators, local foundations, nonprofits are using the next generation of science standards in their teacher preparation programs, course offerings, and grant opportunities. Also, open education resources as well as for-profit organizations have developed science resources aligned with the next generation of science standards. And Colorado STEM Initiative, about 5 years ago, the governor had Colorado Educate Initiative create a road map that helped with to increase STEM participation. So this road map relied heavily upon the next generation of science standards. So some things about the next generation of science standards. First of all, they're based on the 2011 framework for K-12 science education practices, cross-cutting concepts, and core ideas. And this was published by the National Research Council. The next generation science standards were published in 2013. They were developed, led by Achieve and 26 lead partner states encompassing over 250 different organizations. They are internationally benchmarked and support over 100 corporations from the business and industry sector. They also utilize three-dimensional approach to science learning where students explore core ideas by engaging in practices and making connections to concepts that have applications across all domain science. A couple other things about the next generation of science standards. They've been adopted by 20 states. They've been adapted by 18 states. They have been adopted or used by at least 12 Colorado school districts. And one of the things that we wanted to consider is, what are we hearing on the other side? So what are the critics saying? So there are really four main categories that the critics fall into. The first one is that next generation of science standards emphasize scientific practices at the expense of content, where the idea would be that content knowledge should be the ultimate goal of science education. But truly, students learn when they get to participate and practice science and not just learn content. Another criticism, or another critic, what the critic said was that next generation of science standards does not contain the nature of science. So the idea is that we go back to a place where we have the scientific method that is a linear approach, that we start with a question and we work through to a conclusion. That kind of thinking is still extremely important, but that linear approach is obsolete and outdated, and we fall back on the practices of science and engineering. Third, there was some concern that the next generation of, yes?
Mr. Durham?
Why is the scientific method outdated?
It's not that it is outdated.
You just said it was outdated.
Well, the point is that when scientists engage in true scientific exploration, they're not always starting in this linear fashion, where they start with a question, move to a hypothesis, and then go through that process. Mm-hmm. What the next generation of science standards do is they bring in the science and engineering practices that share all of that thinking, but it's not that linear approach. So the outdated part is that it's a linear approach, as opposed to we do this kind of thinking in different places depending on what the problem that is proposed.
So we might start with the, as it appears you've done here, you might start with the answer and work backwards?
Yes, or you might start with looking at evidence. So the very first step would say...
That makes a lot of
Yeah,
sense.
it
Now
does.
let's start, we know what the answer is, so now we just prove it's true.
No, I'm sorry.
That's what you said.
No, I guess what I mean to say is that we might start with looking at evidence. So examining evidence might be the first step that we do, and then we might circle back and come up with the questions. And then from the question, we might design an experiment to answer that question.
As in an observation? We start with some kind of an
Yep.
observation? and
Yep,
then-
oftentimes. So it's really more about the entry point, as opposed to having a linear process that always starts with one place that always ends with another place.
So if we start with the observation the Earth is getting warmer and we discover it isn't, then we just have another observation to make sure we get to the same cause, that it's actually not getting warmer. Is that
Well, it's a lot of.
fair to say, or?
I would say that really it's more about looking at the evidence, and not trying to put things into place where evidence is directing, or that
Well, the evidence was, I mean, it was a conclusion beyond a reasonable doubt 5 years ago, the Earth was getting warmer. That doesn't seem to be, we don't call it global warming anymore because it turns out the Earth wasn't getting any warmer.
Yeah, but most of Greenland is gone.
And that's a bad thing.
Well,
Have you ever been to Greenland?
I passed over.
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily consider it a bad thing.
Board Member Rankin?
I just want to do a little follow-up here. Let me go back to the question here, what the critics say. The critics said it's not linear, so that's a bad thing? Is that what the critics are
What-
saying?
what
Is
the
that where this discussion came
when it comes to the scientific method, when I was in 7th grade, I learned the scientific method, where we started with the question. It was very prescriptive, and you went from one step to the next step to the next step. And what the science and engineering practices do through the next generation of science standards, it really is about the kind of thinking that scientists do.
So is the answer to my question yes or no? Did the critics say that it is not
Thank you.
linear?
That the critics say that we don't call it the scientific method anymore.
Wait. We don't call it the scientific method anymore. What do we call it?
We call it science and engineering practices.
Well, that was. So are you saying then that they actually don't teach the scientific method anymore?
It's when you look at what scientists do through actual research, It's very few scientists actually start with a process that starts in one step, which would be asking a question and then moving through the process of creating a hypothesis and then designing an experiment. All of those things still absolutely happen in science. It's just some of the critics want it to be lockstep, that we always start here and we always end here. And science is much more of a cyclical science, where we may be coming across, as I said earlier, we may be starting with a question, but we may be starting with an observation. And that observation may lead to a question that we want to answer, and then we may design the experiment. So the kind of thinking that's encompassed in the scientific method, that kind of thinking is there, but what the critics were saying is they wanted it to be still very linear, very lockstep.
So kids, for example, children make observations.
Absolutely, absolutely.
They don't start with a hypothesis.
In many cases, absolutely.
None of my kids start with a
Yeah.
hypothesis. But certain observations, and then why,
That's right. The
And then-
observation may lead to a question.
right, and then some guidance to,
That's why kindergarten kids always play with water and objects.
proceed, please.
Thank you. And the last was that, or the third one is that the next generation science standards were mediocre. They initially received a C rating from the Fordham Institute. At that time, Colorado Academic Standards received a D rating. And the interesting thing is, now that schools and districts are adopting and adapting the next generation of science standards, those standards are actually receiving A's and B's from the Fordham. So it's kind of a strange situation where
Which
where
standards?
the next generation of science
The next,
standards. Yeah, the ones that are adopted and adapted. And lastly, next generation of science standards, some of the critics say they're hard to read and confusing. And I think what we've done in Colorado is by creating a single template that's being used from early grades all the way up through high school that has the exact same components, really does help with the understanding of what our Colorado academic standards will look like in the future. So for an example, one of the things that was changed in the process of the revision is an example that should be on the screen that's also in front of you. So when we look at what the Colorado academic standards were from 2009, when we're looking at middle school physical science, the Colorado academic standards, the evidence outcome states predict and evaluate the movement of an object by examining the forces applied to it. Whereas the next generation of science standards, when we look at the evidence outcome that we would be pulling from them, say plan an investigation to provide evidence that the change in an object's motion depends on the sum of the forces on the object and the mass of the object. So really there are three components here. There's a core idea, which is the force in motion. There's the practice, which is planning and carrying out investigation. And then there's the cross-cutting concept, which is cause and effect.
Mr. Durham?
Which could be summarized as objects in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted on by an outside force, which is one of Newton's laws. So you really don't need all that, you just need Newton's law. And somehow we don't want people to memorize Newton's law anymore, or what?
But does Newton, just saying Newton's law, does it mean anything?
Newton's law of motion.
Well,
What do you mean it doesn't mean anything?
well, I think,
Objects in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted on by an outside
Right.
force.
but this gives teachers an explanation.
If they need an explanation, they shouldn't be teaching science.
This gives
Mr.
kids a
Durham.
deeper understanding other than
That's
just
right.
memorizing something that they may or may not understand unless they actually experience it.
Yeah, and that's what we do in
Period.
pools of water.
So
And-
the generation of American scientists and engineers that put a man on the moon, taught by the method of objects in motion tend to stay in motion unless acted on by an outside force, were just lucky. They didn't really understand. They were handicapped by the lack of all this additional dictum, but somehow we got a man on the moon anyway with really not much more than the slide rule. So this is better than that, is what you're saying.
With the three components, that core idea of force and motion is still there. but.
I don't
it's,
see it. I mean, am I
Sports
not
in
reading?
motion with the core idea. It is the core idea. And then the practice is how they, the idea is that they will have to be able to plan an investigation and carry out the investigation around Newton's laws, and then connect it to a bigger idea, which is cause and effect.
Yeah, we don't call it Newton's law then.
Oh, I'm sorry, Board Member Mesner.
Maybe I'm too early. You have more to go over.
Right.
Yes.
But one of the questions I have is, you say you're adapting, not adopting. So we can talk about that later, but I'd like to hear more about how we're adapting instead of adopting. We can do that after you're done if you want.
All right. I'm going to turn it over
with this one.
to Dr. Warren.
Okay. Again, my name is Dr. Charlie Warren. I've been a science teacher and educator since the 70s, and I've seen all of these standards movements coming and improving, and I'm very pleased and proud to be involved in this process. Before I get started, I also want to say thank you to all of you and to my CTE colleagues who have been an amazing support for our committee. As a summary of proposed revisions for the science applicable to all the grades, we are planning to and have drafted a revision of all grade level expectations as questions, because that is the process of inquiry that is science, rather than statements. This would be different than other content areas that are not embedded in that kind of a mindset. We're going to change titles within the right side of the document to Colorado Essential Skills and Science and Engineering Practices, elaboration on the grade level expectation, and cross-cutting concepts. This is part of that adaptation that you referred to. We're going to modify the format of the prepared graduate competencies to include a sentence stem that emphasizes the connections to science and engineering practices, and add one new prepared graduate competency that we heard about in the feedback, specifically around the concept of waves. Waves is involved not just in ocean waves, but light waves and sound waves and all that kind of stuff. Here we go. Yeah. Okay, we're also going to add clarification statements, which provide examples or clarification of evidence outcomes, and boundary statements, which identify the limits to conceptual development at the end of each grade level. For example, use the periodic table as a model to predict the relative properties of elements based on the patterns of electrons in the outermost energy levels of atoms. That's a fairly dense statement. The clarification statement is that examples of properties that could be predicted from patterns could include reactivity of metals, types of bonds formed, numbers of bonds formed, and reactions with oxygen. And then a boundary statement, limited to main groups of elements. In other words, you can't see it on my tie there, but it's in rows. So those first several rows that are much easier to depict for youngsters especially, does not include quantitative understanding of ionization energy beyond relative trends. And just to interpret that a little bit, if I'm a middle school teacher, which I have been for 40 years, I'm not going to use a calculus model to try and explain quantitative approach to this. It'll be more of a conceptual model using diagrams and concepts. Okay? All right. Specifically at grade levels, proposed revision to elementary, we're going to shift a number of concepts and skills between elementary grades in order to establish greater coherence and alignment with research-based learning progressions for science. This results in significant changes to the elementary grades, including 5th grade, which is currently tested. This is in response to the pre-work that was done for us by West Ed that showed that we were lacking coherence, especially in our elementary grades. So we're going to fix that.
Well, that's, that's something I'd like to comment on, that is one of the criticisms I have heard, is that there is not enough specificity in the expectations for elementary students, and that too much is assumed about what those elementary students know when they get to the higher grades.
That's correct, and that's what we're
So is that part of your adaptation?
That's part of the adaptation, right. In other words, the research of the progression of how students learn it from very early ages through high school is going to be in much better shape. Proposed revisions to the middle school grades. We're going to shift some concepts and skills between middle grades and to 5th grade in order to establish that greater coherence and alignment with research-based learning progressions for science, and shift the 8th grade chemistry components to earlier grades while strengthening the physics components. One of the things that's very interesting about the way science concepts are put together and grow is that to really understand biology, you have to apply the chemistry and physics. To understand earth science, you have to apply the chemistry and physics. So we're making that correction as well. Proposed revision to high school, we're going to shift some concepts and skills previously taught at the high school level to the middle school level to allow for additional topics to be taught at the high school level. And is this Melissa?
Like what?
For example, some of the chemistry concepts, especially when we're talking about atomic theory, it's very important that they understand periodicity, how we believe the concept of an atom is and how it interacts, moving that more into the middle school where that understanding can be, then when they get to the chemistry in high school, they can go much deeper.
So before talking about our next slide is actually about options for consideration, because clearly this is a more substantial set of recommendations than you've heard from any of the other content areas. Before talking about that, which actually will shift our conversation a bit, I wanted to provide opportunity for board members to ask more questions of our committee chairs regarding some of these proposed revisions.
So I have a question. When we look at high school and the advanced placement science courses and the IB courses, for example, 9th grade IB science is actually chemistry and physics. It's not biology. Does this align with what's being done in those national type programs?
Tests.
And assessments, right, but also the curriculum. I mean, there's a specific curriculum, if I'm not mistaken, for the AP classes and for the IB classes.
Yes, I believe this alignment does that. And that was one of the important things to consider with this. There are so many different curricular arrangements between AP and CP and IB, and all of those things are very important to our individual schools. So we want to make sure that within our standards, we allow them to find a place where their program still aligns without major shifts.
Mm-hmm.
For example,
the kids are prepared.
And the kids are prepared.
For them.
Yeah, for
Because
example.
right now I'm not sure they are.
Yeah, in IB, it's not something that they can be in IB school and move things around with. So they have to be able to find their curriculum within the Colorado academic standards.
Right. Any other questions? Board Member McClellan.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Because your first and foremost, thank you for your service on the committee. It's very much appreciated. And thank you, Dr. Warren, for explaining why the need for a realignment of some of these standards with respect to where they fall in relation to grade level. On that topic, did your committee have much discussion about recommendations with respect to the speed of implementation, given that we have a wide variety of districts in Colorado, from tiny agate to really big DPS? Any discussion or suggestion on in consideration of that adjustment?
This is a discussion that happens every time the committee meets. As a former rural superintendent, I had a science department of 3. We could have sat down and in an afternoon realigned our curriculum, and we still wouldn't be able to afford to do everything we needed to do. It's a very difficult process. I would refer to John. John works in a much larger system than I was. It's a bigger challenge. John?
It's a bigger challenge, and I think it needs to be addressed. I think if we do not have a plan or options in place, we would miss opportunities for this, for the changes to be done well and meet the needs of the kids.
So I have another question. As you have met together with teachers, directors, et cetera, how much variation do you see across our districts? Are they all very aligned with the current standards that we have? No, they can't be, because we've got 12 districts that have already adopted Next Gen and others that maybe have other adaptations?
I'm not sure how to answer that exactly, because as a local control state, it is highly variable from place to place. I know the places where I have experience, some are very aligned already with NGSS because they know that that's where AP and IB have aligned. Other places don't work as much with the Next Gen standards and are simply trying to make sure that their students are ready for the Colorado Assessment Program, which is based on the Colorado academic standards. So I'm not sure exactly how to answer that one.
So there's I think what you're saying is
it's
there's
a
a lot
wide
of-
variety,
right.
yes.
How about in Ed Prep?
Ed Prep, it's pretty exciting to make this move, because whether it's Fort Lewis or Mesa or CU or my colleagues at CU Pueblo or Colorado Springs, as I talk to all of them, all of those science education departments have been using the Next Gen standards since they came out in 2013. So I think this brings our K-12 system into a place where those new teacher candidates coming in are really prepared to hit the ground running. And they're not going to have to make yet another adjustment. They'll be very familiar with it when they come into the system.
But for our existing science teachers, there may or may not be some.
It may be an adjustment for teachers who came out before, say, 2015.
May I ask a question?
Yes, please.
So does this mean that some of these teachers who will be, teaching for a long time will probably have to be retrained? There'll have to be some training done if they didn't
I
get
think
this.
there's a heavy professional development load that's going to have to be done no matter what.
Okay.
I think this change makes it easier. For one thing, as John said in the NGSS standards, these standards and the framework for science education on which it is based are all widely available by the internet. So it's not going to be something where they all have to go buy new textbooks.
Okay.
But it is something where they are going to have an opportunity to meet.
Mhm. Okay. And by meeting, you mean training?
Mm-hmm. I do.
Any other questions? Board Member Rankin?
I wonder how much this costs.
I have a hard time
It's free.
knowing where to begin with this question, so I'm just going to throw it out there. This particular throw everything out and start over again is a pretty huge step for us. I mean, every 6 years we're supposed to tweak. This is bringing in a steam shovel and just rolling over everything we have. Is this a complete program that has assessments along with it, grade levels already in place, tests, a package deal, so that if we throw everything out, this is going to slide right in?
If I may, I wouldn't characterize it that way exactly. I think this is still a revision. Bear in mind, I was on the committee when we wrote the first set, and we were using many of the source documents at that time to create the Colorado academic standards that the Next Gen standards were also based. The 2061 standards from the American Association for the Advancement of Science, for example. So it's more like we're converging in a direction rather than jumping off of one ship and into another. They are very convergent, and it really is a revision, not really a throwing it out and starting over.
And in addition, it's not a program. These are really standards. And as we alluded to and discussed, that the resources are being developed, are being aligned to next generation of science standards. And so those resources are going to be available through open source, but also through products that you can purchase. Those will be the bridge between what the standards are and making sure what happens in the classroom.
Okay,
Excuse me.
so right now,
Oh, go ahead.
so right now, we're just talking about standards.
That's correct.
Next generation doesn't have all that backfill in it that we have to do in the state, so we will be developing that in the future.
It's not a curriculum, it's standards.
Okay. So some of these teachers then that are already studying this are going to come out and be putting it within their classroom, even if we don't have the same standards, because we may have a few standards with next generation that we agree with, but there are others that we don't. Now, what I've read about next generation is that it should be adopted in whole and not piecemeal. But what I'm hearing here is we are combining what we have in Colorado rather than just bringing in all new next generation, already adopted, ready-to-go standards.
Well,
You can
I
help
think,
me with that.
Yeah, I think one of the things to consider with that is that our Colorado law does have specific requirements for what standards have to look like. And when next generation standards were written, they didn't have those constraints. We still have to follow those constraints. So our adaptation is going to be to use those standards and resources to converge with ours and make sure we meet the intent and meaning of our own statute to be able to continue to function with our Colorado system.
And you said 20 states have already adopted the standards? 14 of those states were developers of the standards, so you can see why they would be all in. And I believe it was New Mexico that had some difficulty adopting the standards because of what I just said. They didn't want to adopt all of them. They wanted to, there were some that were extremely controversial. And so they went ahead and, what did they do? Adopt them, thinking that the ones they had questions for, they could put those in there. But, I mean, there's a lot of controversy, and there's a lot of controversy about this next generation. So I guess I have to understand it more. I mean, if 20 states have adopted it and 26 were involved in it, I want to know what those other 6, I mean, we should be learning from what has happened and be able to incorporate that into ours. And you're going to have to educate us, I think, on a lot of this. And maybe some of my colleagues know a lot more about science than I do. But there's a lot of questions about this particular area of study. And I know I'm not telling you anything new.
No, it sounds like something that we have people on the committee who have been more involved in that, and that's something we'll ask them tomorrow.
Yeah.
I would appreciate that. And also look into what Kansas has done. I mean, those are the 2 that I read about that kind of stuck in my mind. And if we can head off a tsunami before we get there, I'd be more than happy to do that.
Absolutely.
Board Member Goff?
Actually, timely conversation. Washington State's Board of Education is this very week discussing implementation of the next generation science standards, and I will be happy to provide a link to where we can find out more about that as soon as I'm notified where that link is, which is today or tomorrow. I'm just asking for, and I apologize if this is repetition for any of you today, on page 6, I believe it is. No, sorry, page 8, the bottom, the last statement. Too many grade level expectations in 7th and 8th grade. And then, how does that line up with the statement farther back, bottom of page 17, that says shift some concepts and skills previously taught at high school to the middle school level, so that additional topics can be taught at high school. How do you line that? How do you talk to your committee? How do you, among your committee members? How do we explain or explain
Yeah, well, that
that
wasn't
to
a surprise.
public. Yeah, how does that?
That wasn't a surprise to our committee members. They knew that as well. So as they've
Right.
worked on shifting and moving them around, they've also looked at how do we then reduce the number that we have in 7th and 8th, so there's more time to do what needs to be done. So while they're all shifting, there is some adjustment in some numbers.
So there's an understanding that there will be I don't want to use drop-off because that's
Right.
painting the wrong,
Mhm.
it's the wrong connotation of that word, but there is an elimination of load
Mhm.
distributed all in one place.
That's
Okay.
fair.
And then the only other question I have is kind of related to what my colleagues have asked about. As far as finalization, education, public information sessions, adaptation or adoption, either one, and implementation, do you have a timeline, a preferable timeline that would seem to work best for you and for schools? You know, we've got this July 2018, and just curious as to where your conversation or thoughts have been around.
So we're actually
much
going to go
time?
there next and talk a little bit about some options. So you're right on track. So if it's okay with you, if we just wait to get.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Board Member Flores.
Yes, this whole idea of the linearity, you know, the scientific method as being linear, I think we have to, I mean, I'm thinking about other cultures that are not as linear as, say, our culture. So it's easy to kind of understand. I mean, I'm even thinking about the conversations that we have and, you know, who can step in and when here. And, you know, I'm thinking that's not how it's done. For instance, in the culture that I came from, where the sport, if you call it a sport, is to get to solutions, to get to problem solving, and not the linearity of this follows this, follows this, follows this. So that, you know, when the idea comes up, you enter into that conversation to kind of add to it. Not to say, you know, this is my idea, but it's an idea that just came up and we're trying to solve this problem. So it's timely and it's at this time, and people don't think that it's wrong. That, you know, we call it cutting off, which basically is not cutting off. It's just a different way of approaching the solution. And I think there's a lot of merit to what you're doing. And I just remembering being with in a class with lots of other cultures and, you know, really discussing kind of this issue, not just in language, but, you know, just solving problems for, let's say, a case study, I remember, and how some people from a different culture were approaching it. And I thought, you know, that's really interesting, how they're going to the solution and not going, you know, kind of the linear sort of way that, you know, I had written the case study, but I like it.
Thank you. Mr. Durham, did you have another question? Did I see your hand a little while ago?
Not at this time.
Okay.
Madam Chair.
Board Member Rankin.
Ms. Cordial, I received an email this morning at 5 minutes to 9 before our 9 o'clock meeting with a lot of input on this topic. Does the committee have access to that? Okay.
Yes, the committees have received all of the feedback, so whatever comes, in fact, we included in that packet, not just the emails that have gone to the state board email address, but the other communications that have gone to our dedicated standards revision email.
Actually, they get more input than we do.
Right, so we
'Cause
just
it
wanted to
doesn't
make
go
sure that you saw, because there's,
specifically the
right.
state board, right.
So there was a number of emails that were, you know, that were kind of a few like form type emails that kind of came
That was
through.
exactly where I was going with
Right,
this.
and then there've been a number of other emails that have talked about really specific pieces of the
Yes.
standards by different scientists and professors and such. There have been a few emails that have been submitted bringing up, I think, some of the points that have been brought up here around how would this look like in implementation, especially this would be a big change, and so you know, some cautions from some rural educators and some elementary teachers. So there's a lot to consider here.
So that, Dr. Colesman, do the ones we received, were they handpicked to give to us, or was that just the latest? Those are the only ones that I really was
Yeah,
alluding
that was
to.
all of the communications that dealt with science. So we just wanted to make sure that you saw directly what people were saying
So
about
Dr.
science.
Colesman, since you're dealing with all these other standards too, are there others that have the form letters that one person does and then sends them out, and then we get the same letter or a letter with all the names down below?
Yeah, I don't think
That's
that we've
unusual
seen.
to me.
I don't think that we've seen as many. I think because there's a recognition that this is a significant kind of proposal that the committee is bringing forward, that there are people who want to make sure that you as board members kind of know what they think. And sometimes that comes through kind of a form letter, and we get multiple copies of
They
those
all
letters.
think exactly that.
And then there was one more additional question, and I'm going to have to go back. I can't remember what page it was on, but it was in the beginning where you had an example of what we have in Colorado, and then what the additional change would be. If somebody can come across that page number.
She said page 14. Page 14.
Yeah, that's it. My question is, what grade level is that?
This is 8th grade.
Thank you.
So this is sort of a general question before you get onto the specifics, which I'm looking forward to. And that is, when we've had expert reviewers in all of the different standard areas, are they going to come back and review the changes that you all have recommended? Are we going to get that kind of feedback yet again from them?
So that's a very good question. What we have, we put that expert review on the front end, which are those benchmarking reports, with the idea that if the committees respond to what the expert reviewers have indicated as the problems, then the problems would be kind of essentially addressed. We hadn't intended on having another review. There might be something that we would perhaps consider for science because it is a bigger change, whereas if in math the recommendation was to shift a few concepts and those concepts are shift, then we're assuming that we're now in alignment. But we can certainly adjust our thinking on that if you would like.
Okay. Any other questions? Please proceed.
Okay, I did want to make a point of clarification with respect to the conversation around adaptation versus adoption. In terms of looking at the adaptation versus adoption, the standards themselves were adapted to fit within the Colorado academic standards framework itself. So in terms of the distinction, we were trying to make sure that we make sure that this is clear, that the language from the Next Generation Science Standards is about the same or identical in certain places. And so, but that language was not held within the Next Generation Science Standards framework document itself. It has been kind of adapted and adjusted to be able to fit within the Colorado Academic Standards document. So the language, we wanted to make sure that this was clear. The language itself was still there, and on top of that, what the committee did also do was not take all of the Next Generation Science Standards. There were perhaps a few that weren't included or incorporated, but we wanted to make sure that that was an important point that we continued, because I know we've heard some distinction between adaptation and adoption.
I'm sorry, I just totally did not follow that.
All right, well, I'll explain it again.
Because it sounded to me like you were saying that we said that we were adapting, but actually we're adopting. So when was it that they fit the Colorado academic standards?
So again, that was part of the committee work, and I'll actually turn that question back over to one of the committee
I think it
members.
goes back to the prepared graduate competencies are Colorado's prepared graduate competencies. And then as we look at the research support and the coherence to get to those, we can source things like the Next Gen standards to help us meet what we decided in the last revision, and then this time reaffirm with the addition of WAVES, that these Next Gen standards support what Colorado educators decided are what our graduates want. So in that sense,
So you're only adapting as necessary.
that's correct.
Well,
So-
I'm disappointed now.
Say more.
So I'll give maybe a different example would help. So this is, you know, kind of a portion of the Next Generation Science Standards. And now we're on video, so people at home can see this as well, all the thousands watching. So what you'll notice is that, you know, this is different in structure without even looking at the words, because nobody can see anyway. But you can see it's a different structure, a different format to how those are presented. But Colorado's academic standards all have the same kind of framework, where we start with this idea of a prepared graduate competency, a grade level expectation, and then we explain what we, how you know that a student can meet that grade level expectation through those evidence outcomes. So the committee has taken much of the content of the Next Gen standards and placed it into our framework using our language, and they've added specific things just for Colorado. So, you know, if we wanted to take a look at, you know, like, here's an example of highlighted portions. This is 5th grade, and again, you don't need to worry about like what's highlighted, but you can see what is highlighted here, though, that comes from the Next Generation Science Standards. So we want to make it really, really clear, there's a significant portion of the actual Next Gen standards in Colorado's, but it's a different format, and it's not the entirety of the Next Generation Science Standards.
Dr. Colesman and Dr. Cobb, maybe you can both answer this for me. When we get done with this, are people going to say your Colorado science standards, or are they going to say the Next Gen science standards? How is it going to be referred to?
So I would say it would be really similar to how we talk about our math and reading, writing, communicating standards, because when the Common Core state standards were adopted by the state board in 2010, those were incorporated into the math and reading, writing, communicating standards, but we call them Colorado's academic standards because we have kind of Coloradoized them, meaning we have put them in our structure, we have added content that Colorado has thought is important, and we've made adjustments based on what Colorado thinks is important.
So the same will apply to the science.
Should the board go in this direction? Yes.
Thank you.
Okay.
Proceed.
So this goes back to Board Member Goff's question, so thank you for being patient. So given the scope and the impact of these recommendations, and if the board wanted to go in this direction, or just even thinking about creating some room for decision making, because we know yesterday we presented this ambitious schedule of we're going to review and revise the standards and approve them all by June. What we wanted to do is kind of create a little bit of space for you and to think about. One thing that we could do is solicit additional feedback on the merits of the Next Generation Science Standards very specifically. That could be through, you know, kind of surveying. We could have more meetings very specifically about this so that you know more than just the letters you've received what people are saying. We could engage science coordinators, curriculum coordinators to ask those questions of if we were to go in this direction, what supports would you need? How do you recommend that we would transition to this? We could extend the timeline just for the science review and revision process to give you more time on this question. I don't think there are any standards police out there that would come get us on July 2nd if the science standards weren't completed by then. And I think that we would show a good faith effort in moving in this direction.
But you're not calling for a July board meeting?
No, we would not call for that.
Okay, just want to make that clear.
But if the board determines we just need a few more months for this because we don't want to jump in, we want to learn more about it, we want to make sure we're making an informed decision, I think that there's room for that. And then also, if the board does decide to move in this direction, there's some implementation considerations that we could consider, because this wouldn't necessarily just be a revision. This is a significant change. So it could be that unlike the other 2-year process that in the other content areas where districts have 2 years to adjust their local standards based on changes here, that we might say implementation of science doesn't occur on that same one. It could be that it's a staggered implementation, such that we start with like a beginning grade at each grade band, so that, you know, maybe we start with preschool through first grade in the year 1, and then add second grade and the third grade. But at the same time, we start at 6th grade in middle school and maybe 9th grade at high school. And so that by 3 or 4 years down the road, it's been implemented and kids have gone through a number of years. So there's just a number of ways that we could think about implementation that could provide that time and opportunity. So we just wanted to kind of to present that as ways of kind of maybe reducing a little bit of the pressure and a little bit of the anxiety around making a big decision for a big change.
Comments, colleagues? Board Member Goff?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really more concerned for or on behalf of districts with this. I think, you know, our schedule we can do what we have to do, but considering what we have all been through since 2009, really, and those time spans of transitioning and everything that was impacted by that, I think it would be very, very beneficial to everybody involved if we could have some opportunity, somehow arrange to have in front of us school building leaders, teachers, department chairs, whatever it takes, and parents, frankly, who are a lot involved nowadays with choices of materials, some sort of, you know, whatever the advisory capacity is, district accountability committees, or I don't know, community members. But that would be my real concern, as far as smooth as possible implementation and awareness on the part of how this is different. All the things the principles we seem to have agreed on about what we want for our high standards. So I just thank you for being so prepared with that and answering our questions about that. And I totally know and respect that it's a great concern to all of you for the success of students with this. Appreciate it.
Board Member Masnick?
Well, I know that I had talked to Dr. Colesman, and there was a mention of criticism of these standards, and I had asked for that. The article I pulled up, one of the articles I looked at was from a science teacher, and some of the concerns are about not enough content, the assumption of content knowledge of elementary students, the outdated breaking off of inquiry practices, calling it outdated. I think that it's along the scientific method issue. Not enough, for instance, high school chemistry, they felt like there weren't enough experiments being done. I mean, I'm not going to get to visit this forward, but I would like to see some more serious presentation to the state board of the actual criticisms and concerns with this. And one of the concerns I have about things like next generation science standards, just as it was with Common Core state standards, is that it seems that that's the way things happen now. There is a group of states or experts who get together to design something, and everybody or most everybody agrees that this is what should be done, and then the College Board and IB, they sign on too and say, we approve these, and pretty soon everybody's adopting those, and a lot of states, school boards, districts are being pressured. You need to get on board with this. So that's just a general concern I have without being, that's why I love the idea of adaptation instead of adoption. because I'd sure like to see a little more out-of-the-box thinking, and so that every state doesn't look exactly the same, and that we're not just all jumping on and adopting what everybody else is doing. Sort of like the cool kid thing, you know. You're gonna do that because all your friends are doing it. So I'd like to see some more concrete examples of, and maybe some discussion from your committees about whether some of these criticisms are valid. And are you sure you want to go down that road?
Board Member Carroll?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would be glad to have input, particularly from districts that we think might have the greatest challenge for implementation, just to help us avoid the unintended consequence of putting a difficult hurdle in front of teachers and districts. I want to make sure that if we are going forward with the next generation practices, that we want to make sure that we're providing implementation options that are livable for, especially for the districts for whom this might create the greatest challenge. That would be helpful to me to make sure we can avoid doing harm. Thanks.
Thank you.
Mr. Durham?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Elfson, 12 districts, or at least 12 districts, I think the statement have adopted these standards. Is Cherry Creek one of them?
Cherry Creek has used the standards to really augment what the Colorado academic standards have done. So really we've plugged in the kind of thinking that happens in the next generation of science standards into the portions that already existed in Colorado academic standards.
Was that a yes or a no?
It's not a full adoption by any means. Cherry Creek is aligned with the Colorado academic standards without question.
Thank you. And then Dr. Warren, what would you say would be the objective that you would hope to achieve for Colorado by the adoption of these standards? What's the end objective?
I think, to quote, I believe it was Isaac Newton, in science we like to stand on the shoulders of giants. We want to make sure that we are using the best thinking that there has been in science education over the years, and then, based on that, produce something for which there are already free or very low cost resources and supports that make it easy for our school districts to put together their curriculum to bring all of our students up to a very high standard of scientific literacy and preparation for science and STEM careers.
Well, I would suggest that for the legislature and for the taxpayers, the objective would be to graduate a larger number of students who will have successful careers in science and mathematics. Would that be an objective?
I think that's one objective. I don't think it's an objective for all students. I think one of the objectives in science education is to make certain that we have scientifically literate voters and citizens.
So, would you say that, I mean, with 12 districts now using these particular standards, which are trending toward, as a colleague of mine put it, heavy on methodology and light on knowledge, and so there's been a trend apparently in the state toward these or similar kinds of standards. If using the old-fashioned scientific method, it would appear not using the old one, using yours, it would appear that based on the numbers, we are producing fewer high school graduates who go to college and major in STEM disciplines, or relatively speaking, today than we did 20 years ago. That would appear, all the complaints we hear, that would appear to be the case. So, if that is the case, then to what extent, I guess the conclusion, scientific conclusion would be that the trend toward the heavy on methodology, light on knowledge efforts have really failed to meet the objective of producing more and better high school graduates who can participate in college-level STEM disciplines?
I don't think I know the research on that well enough to give you a really good answer.
Don't you think you ought to know?
I think
Because
it's,
don't you think it's important? I mean, we hear from our employers when we had that advisory council, we hear from our employers that their concern is that there is a shortage, that there is a serious shortage of this particular discipline. And I would think that one of the objectives, one of the fiduciary duties, even at your level, that somebody ought to owe the people that pay your salaries, would be to try to remedy that problem. There's no evidence that this methodology or the change toward this methodology remedies that problem. Is there?
Again, I think I would have to do some research and look at those numbers. I'm not familiar with the most recent trends in that. The only things I can really address with that are anecdotal, and the fact that our population on the Front Range continues to grow and we continue to attract STEM business and industry. So I leave that as an open question. I'll have to investigate it, and with
the
your
answer is
permission, I'll come back and answer.
we import most of those graduates is the answer. At least that's what the CCHE tells us. So, you know, it may be of. I think the answers that I've received here are reflective of the new methodology. That is, you start with what the answer you want the answer to be, and then you work backwards to see if you can prove it. So I don't see that these changes are going to move the ball forward in producing more and better graduates capable of doing college-level work and ultimately entering a career in this field. Because that really, as far as I'm concerned, is what the objective ought to be. And there's certainly, you know, we might hope that, but there's certainly no proof or any reasonable expectation, or based on your own statements, that anybody really cares about achieving that objective, that we want a scientifically literate electorate. And so I would guess that we want a scientifically literate electorate that accepts without any question your little statement on page 121 here about climate change. So is that what you would like to achieve? You want a scientifically literate electorate that without any question accepts your conclusion on page 121 here. Is that what you want?
I don't believe that a scientifically literate citizen would look at a statement like that and then not ask questions. I think they would, a scientifically literate citizen...
Why would you include it as a matter of fact?
I'm sorry, I don't have that in front of me. I would say that this curriculum, it's early. We have not had a generation of students who graduated based on Colorado academic standards as yet, so it's a little early to tell. I would take your supposition about what's happening with our graduates as a scientific question, and we should investigate that.
It's where we should start, actually, not end.
I believe that's true.
But you have stated that we don't want to do that anymore, that we don't want to follow that particular scientific method.
To be fair, I think there is no the scientific method. There are scientific methods. Your observation that we are importing a lot of people from out of state to fill our STEM careers is an awesome observation from which to design an investigation. And that's an example of the iterative model of scientific methodologies that John was talking about.
I think it's been investigated already, and we see those reports from the CCHE on a very regular basis. I'm surprised you haven't bothered to look at them as you move forward. Well, I would like you to take, I would like the committee to take a look at the conclusion on page 121, before these things come back to us. I think that's the kind of thing that should be removed. And I also think that we ought to go back to the value of at least some rote memorization of scientific principles that I think in the long run do help people become scientifically literate. I mean, one of the things I always enjoy is asking people, why do brakes work? What's the scientific principle why brakes work? Be surprised how many people don't have a clue. They work because you push on the pedal, right? That must be the answer. And I would guess that 9 out of 10 graduates today, many of whom have been who have been educated by this trending method, could no more answer that question than fly. So, however, if they'd bothered to memorize some of Newton's theories, they might have or Newton's laws, they might have a pretty good idea. So I think this goes in the wrong direction. In a number of fields, I find a real value to rote memorization. I think it's a healthy exercise. It's good in intellectual development, and it actually has some long-term residual values as well. So I won't be, unless there's some changes here, I'm not going to be voting for these standards, and particularly if they contain conclusions as matter of facts. Thank you.
Board Member Rankin?
I have a question about, and I always will have this question about free resources. You know, this is going to be really available to teachers. That just frightens me. I mean, I think it's wonderful if they're free, but nothing is free. What's behind this? You know, is it free and then they tell you that climate change is one way or not? I don't know. And just because it's free and online is probably the most frightening thing I heard today.
Ms. Rankin, there's a song from West Side Story that summarizes it.
In America, yeah.
Everything's free in America.
Board Member McClellan?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think that I do not speak for Mr. Durham is the understatement of the day, but I just wanted to share a contrasting view that, to my understanding, these standards aren't merely meant to be utilized for children who aspire to become future scientists, but it may be part of a well-rounded education, and that having these standards allows parents and students to understand what we're delivering to them or what the intent is for the delivery, so that it can mean something when you've graduated from these classes from a Colorado public school. So I am supportive of the work of your committee, and I look forward to hearing about options to make implementation as stress-free as possible in the areas where we need to make sure that we're being sensitive to any challenges for implementation. And thank you very much again for your work.
Did I see another hand over here? No?
No, I've said no.
So in addition to hearing from our educators on what it's going to take to implement this, were we to approve it, I would be grateful if you can make a guess on the resources that are necessary, the cost of the resources. I think it's going to be a significant worry to our districts if we don't have some other way to support the professional development that we expect to be needed. I mean, I don't know how you're going to figure that out, but that might be something that the districts can share with you, what they expect the cost to be.
Thank you.
Do you have some comments, Commissioner? No? Okay. Thank you very much. We look forward to your progressions on this.
Thank you very much.
an average of 10 to 15 minutes every board meeting being totally in.
What do we have left, Katie?
This is an update on the
That's
performing
this board
schools
meeting.
work. Some of the board members have
What?
progress,
And why,
kind of what we're learning, and the way we're helping well-performing
why
schools.
The
rote
ones on the clock.
memorization
Or
In the turnaround
You can
network
make
and stuff.
you can
Yeah,
make
and like-
yourself, you can choose yourself to memorize these
And-
things. And yes, it does help. I can't think of one single content area where that doesn't happen. You're estimating an hour. I knew this was gonna happen. You're hard.
We're just kind of thinking, maybe
Can't
if you guys have an hour, we should take 5 minutes before we start. That's okay with you? I know you've been
Totally.
waiting.
Well, it's in it.
Totally. And we don't need to take an hour at all. We can go faster. It's up to you guys how much you want to discuss.
Well, but you never can tell what kind of questions we'll
I
have, so.
know.
How about a
I know.
5-minute or?
Sure.
Please.